Oh
And
yeah.
okay,
I
I'm
was
gonna hop in here real quickly.
Easy
Antlizer, you
clap.
do win the tournament. However,
Whoa. The debate hasn't
Well, are
even
they
started.
here?
Give me a
but
chance, King.
well, okay, but Pan has opted. No, Pan is going to make sure your
Cool.
research didn't go to waste. So
I'm so
Pan is
fucked.
going to debate nationalism, globalism. So I'm going to ask everyone else to mute, and it's going to be
Alright,
between
so
Antlizer and Pan.
how's this debate gonna go?
Good luck, guys.
Antlizer is gonna go first because I have no position yet.
Alright, cool.
Like I'm still formulating my idea.
So today I'll be arguing for
But go
globalism.
for it.
So globalism is a term which has been used to describe various systems with scope beyond merely international. So essentially, and the definition I'm going to be using today is the operation of or planning of economic and foreign policy on a global basis. The term globalism has also been used to describe various endeavors begun after World War II, such as the United Nations, the Warsaw Pact, and stuff like NATO and the European Union. Of all which I'm sure people have varying views on, but essentially the core idea is the same, which is that when nations work together, good things sort of arise, depending on the policies. So the reason why I'm for globalism is
Okay.
is for mainly 2 to 3 different reasons. It's that the globalism allows for the free flow of information, culture, and technology. Globalism leads to economic growth through trade, and that globalism also leads to more beneficial immigration through skilled migration and stuff like that. And that's my point.
Okay. While I wouldn't disagree that there are times where countries working together can be beneficial, that doesn't mean and like so in certain cases when they make like a pact or a trade agreement or something along the sorts, right? It's there are instances where countries' interests are aligned so they can work together. However, it's naive to think that it's always the case that countries' interests are aligned and should always work together. People have lots of differing beliefs, and the only way to make sure that everyone is fairly represented is if people have their own distinct bodies. The culture of America is going to be a lot different than, I don't know, the culture of some uh, I don't know, some random country in Asia or in Eastern Europe, right? So the best way to make sure that we can all coexist and get along is so that we can all follow our own rules in our own jurisdiction. That makes it so we don't have to conflict over which is, moral conflicts over which is right and which is wrong, because we all have our own jurisdiction. So I think that there are obviously instances where countries can work together, but they can work together as separate entities. There's no reason to you know undermine the differences that makes countries
Cool.
what they are. I guess that'd be
Generally,
my
I
starting
do
point.
agree with you in some cases that like in the sense that countries should have their own jurisdiction. Generally speaking, I'm not too much of a fan of of the idea of a world republic. I feel that that form of government can lead to inefficiencies in governance. So that's why I favor like systems such as the United Nations. Obviously, the United Nations has its own flaws, which can be improved upon. But so systems like the United Nations or the European Union, I think, are not bad models to follow. You also mentioned, do you work together as separate entities? I'm not. I don't. I don't really necessarily make the distinction between like the idea of globalism or just. I don't quite see the distinction between working together and having your own jurisdiction per se. I don't quite understand what you mean by that.
Okay, sure. So, well, I mean, if you think about think about in the war, right? We've got France and we got Britain, we
Yep.
got America versus Nazis and stuff, right? Um, Now those are still their own countries. They're still autonomous. They're still separate, right? They're still France. They're still Britain. They're in the U.S. But they're working together for a common goal. Saying that they're keeping working together for a common goal is, in my opinion, not the same as being one or being together. I know what you're saying. Your definition of you're not talking about some one world government, which is at least a step in the right direction. But if we take a look at the function of organizations like the UN, it's to be a sort of pseudo one world organization. So the problems that I would have with a regular, um, I don't know, with a regular, what's it called? That I would have with a regular one world government still applies to pseudo one world governments like the United Nations. The only reason the United Nations isn't a bigger deal is because no one actually follows it. It doesn't actually act like an international, um, unit. It more acts as the powerful countries exerting their will. So for that point, you know, I. I think that the only reason that the UN is at all tolerable is because it doesn't work. If it did work, it would be a single world government, and that would be, that would be the problem. So I guess I would say that it's definitely an improvement that you only support things like the UN rather than one world governments, but the same problems still apply, especially if what you're advocating for is a stronger form of the UN, presumably, which can enforce its decisions. And if you have an autonomous, if you have an agency which can enforce its decisions on other countries, uh, the the problem of having a one world government starts. So I think that I don't see how you can advocate for something like the United Nations while at the same time saying that you oppose a one world government. I don't see how
I feel
those.
like
I feel like those
my
two terms aren't
when I
separable.
when I mentioned one world government, I feel there's a certain degree of centralization to that characterization of government that I'm speaking of. I feel I feel systems such as the United Nations can work a lot more is if it becomes heavily more democratic in terms of the nations which are present, maybe and like to remove a bit more power from the um I forgot what the term was for the five most powerful nations in the UN. So the Security Council, sorry, security. Yeah. So
Security Summit, the Security Council.
I think giving more power to
Okay.
more like smaller countries
So
and like something like that would lead to more favorable outcomes for these countries. And also, sure, you can argue that it,
so
your another part of your argument was that each country should have its own jurisdiction, correct?
yeah, I mean it's
I
just the only way we can all peacefully coexist.
would hypothetically, wouldn't you be able to make the same argument for, say, states or cities? Samus.
Yeah, I
No,
mean
I'm not.
that's
Not
why.
necessarily.
Are you American? Oh, okay, so then I guess it's not the exact same, but like the distinction in America is that states
Mm-hmm.
truly do have like different laws, right? So that is exactly the reason why we have states in America, because we can't expect, even states have very different cultures, so expecting them all to abide by the same laws is unrealistic and would cause more problems. So that's what I would say. Now, I'd like to pin down your position a little bit. Do you wish, or do you think that the UN's decisions should be binding and enforced on all countries? And if so, how should they be enforced? Because that seems like a central part of globalism to me, at least what you're describing. If you want a stronger UN where the small countries have more say, then how do you plan on doing that?
I feel that there's two ways to go about it. Is through having like increasing the so it's either by having like letting the UN have its own standing army, which I'm hesitant to sort of argue for, but it's also but also that I don't necessarily want a more stronger UN. I want a UN that's more, I guess, equitable to countries that are not in the Security Council, which you might say which is useless because most countries don't follow it, etc., etc. But I feel like I feel
Yeah,
that
I
the
will say
UN
it's
does
useless.
provide some utility in the sense that it provides um, through organs like the International Court of Justice, and also what's the term? Also stuff like also stuff like the solidification of human rights. I feel
So what is the solidification of human rights do? Again, I feel like these are all like the things you're describing are basically optional, and I think that if they're optional, they have no power, and if they're not, and basically, if it's if it's if what you want is globalism, uh,
amazing.
uh,
Yep.
someone, what was I saying? Fuck.
About power, like your
Oh,
options.
yeah,
They don't
yeah.
have
So
power.
if what you're saying is you support globalism in name only, so that we can have all these decrees that sound nice together, like that's fine. I personally don't care. But the globalism I'm worried about is one that can actually enforce its opinions. So I will say that, yeah, having more equitable voting doesn't really
Also,
matter when
it's
no
not
one
the
follows the UN decisions they disagree with. If you take a look at the Human Rights Council, most of us followed it anyways. Like all of the stuff we wrote, all the stuff we wrote in the Human Rights Council were stuff that all the countries already basically had, so that they could call themselves, you know, so they could pat themselves on the shoulder and saying, "Oh, look, I'm, upholding human rights." So can I'm just gonna mute that bot next time it comes in.
I know, good.
Um, yeah, sorry. Um, well, I'm not, anyways. So I don't think that fuck,
Yeah,
that
take your
music
time.
really made me lose my train of thought. Um,
You were talking about power, that you don't want globalism to have power that it can enforce, and if it can enforce it, then what's the point?
Yeah, see,
Yeah.
I feel like exactly. I feel like there's a little bit of a Mott and Bailey going on here, right? You say that, okay, oh, all I want is this sort of globalism, and then when I challenge you on what you actually want, you just retreat to the more defensible position of, oh, well, I just want voluntary agreements between countries. I want agreements that people agree to, like voluntarily, like the rights declaration. I don't actually want it to have enforcing power. So I feel like it's a sort of Mott and Bailey argument, where on one hand you're advocating for globalism, but when I attack your globalism, you're kind of retreating to the point of, like, I'll call it pseudo globalism, where you know it's globalism in
Yeah.
name only, and it's just the
I can sort of
neoliberals
see
patting
where
each other on the back.
I understand I understand that sphere of argumentation. It's just that, like, originally my plan for this debate wasn't to talk about necessarily the United Nations, but more just say if you're a leader of a country, what sort of policies would you prefer to do? That's the sort of thing, rather than geopolitics. I was going to favor more like, yeah, that's like sort of what I was trying to do. So essentially, and my
Okay,
argument
so
for that is just
well,
we need to be
okay,
we
so
need
if
to
we're gonna
focus
talk,
more on
yeah,
international cooperation, and that also includes we need to should voluntarily agree with the UN and making the like something like that. Similar to that.
okay, so sure, like, yeah, we can talk about that. If we think about like, I don't know, let's see. Let's see, because we're changing. It is a little bit of a change, but I still think that who has who's able to understand the interests of a given people the most. For example, like, who's going to have more say about what's good for their own country, the citizens of their own country, right? Why should citizens be asked to, I don't know, sacrifice for people that they
Well, I
don't
think
even
that's
know?
sort
I
of
guess. Why
that's sort
should we
of like
go
a bit of,
about that?
interesting way to frame global trade and such and such. I don't.
I'm not talking about global trade necessarily. I'm just talking about, look, if global
Yes, and
trade
my argument is
benefits
that it
the
does
people of a
benefit the
country,
people
then
of
you
that
should do
particular
it, right?
country, and people
Because
should do it because it
that's
benefits
your
this country and
country.
also benefits the wider world. That's it's the argument that we should, because
Um,
because essentially that this
but okay, but if you already okay, well, can you? I guess let's follow that further. Like, if a country is exploiting the resources of a third world country, how is that going to be, mutually beneficial? Sure, they might agree to it voluntarily, but the industries in these countries are never going to develop to the point where they need to be to compete on an international stage. So what free competition is in for first world countries is for third world countries basically a death sentence. So you can't just use a single standard to deal with both, I would say. There It's not always going to be the case unless you can, like, show me universally it's the case that free trade always um
yeah, and I'd agree with you. I feel
is
that
beneficial
we
for
shouldn't
countries.
apply just one sort of oh, we need to do free trade for this country. It needs to be more nuanced. But essentially, Mike, the core of my argument is that we need to work with other countries for the greater good. So that also comes into climate change, stuff like that.
So what is okay, well, what is the greater good, though? Because I feel like it's kind of a
Greater good essentially means,
strange term.
yeah, I understand that.
Because, like, I'm not sure what you
So
mean
it
when you
would
say the greater
essentially
good.
just mean trying to
Could you elaborate?
maximize the well-being of everyone. Just basic utilitarian. Probably heard this a lot in this sort of service. Well, we
Well,
can
how do
have
we know what
basic.
maximizes the well-being of everyone? How do we know what, let's say, what? How do we know which of two courses of actions will, let's say, benefit the people of Kenya compared to the people of, I don't know, Botswana or something? How can we do a comparison between countries and like how can we like do that in an objective sort of way? I guess like how do you quantify
Well, we can
um
sort of.
the usuals,
Well, how I'd
for lack of a
quantify
better
that is
term?
essentially rather than well-being itself, it's rather the access to fulfill. Sorry, what's the word? It's rather to have the ability to fulfill. Okay, rather the ability to maintain a sense of good well-being, and they being able to
But so like I agree to an extent. Like I encourage charity, right? Like so if there's if there's a big hurricane or something that wrecks up a third world country, I'm not opposed to voluntary donations. However, if I don't think voluntary or donations should be mandatory. If the people of one country don't feel like they can give the resources to help the people of another country, then you know why should they be forced to? Just because of some arbitrary definition of, oh well, this is what we need to maintain for all people's countries. So because of that, we're going to take from one country to give to another. I don't see why that how that could
describe.
be
Can you
anything
explain
but
to me what you mean
arbitrary.
by arbitrary?
Sure. I mean, like, how would you go about saying, okay, well, let's say, for example, one country doesn't have clean water, all right? Um, and I think we can all agree we want the country to have clean water. How do you choose which, uh, how do you choose who's responsible for giving up their water to that country?
See, I wouldn't
How do you
argue that
choose
it's
who's
up to me to
responsible for
choose
that sort
who's
of thing?
responsible for giving more water. I just argue that there are policies in place which you can put in, or like we can try to take actions to allow those countries to gain enough capital to choose how they want to support themselves. But essentially,
So
it's
it's just
voluntary in the sense
voluntary?
that it's like I think the originally this debate was going to be against nationalism, so it's more. I'm assuming it's more like So my argumentation is more catered towards that.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
that's what I'm saying. Why should I am talking about nationalism, right? Like I'm talking about we want the interest of our country to be
sure.
above the interest of, other countries, right? So like if our people want to give water to another country, that's not, that's in our interest to give them water, right? So if it's voluntary, you're not really giving me a situation where I should choose my people's well-being over another country's well-being. You're giving me a situation where it's in my country's interest to benefit another country, right? That's still ultimately acting in my own country's interest. So what I'm trying to get like in the case where it is not um, where it's truly is going to hurt my country and help another country. Because I don't think we disagree that if it doesn't, hurt my country and help another country, that we should do it. What should we do in that case? And why should we, sacrifice our own well-being for the well-being of others? I guess in that sort of sense, especially when there's other people that could also be, you know, there's a diffusion of responsibility type of thing. I'm not sure I see what the motivation is to say, okay, you are morally obligated to help X when you aren't X. Uh, if you'd like to go into that a little bit, kind of like how you're getting an ought statement from that. Like, why ought we do something if it's against our country's best interest and you know not in their
So this is assuming that
if
giving
it's
water
not in
to
our own country's best
that certain
interests?
African country is a drain on your own resources, correct?
Well, we can. It doesn't have to be that. Sure, in that specific case, right? It'll be, I guess, not exactly
No, I
tolerable.
understand
I'm
where you're
trying to get you
going
to.
at, but my
I, I think where we disagree is if we are in a place like, okay, we have enough water for ourselves, but we might not have enough water for ourselves tomorrow. You never know with climate change and everything. Water distribution channels might change. There's no uh, giving giving resources away is never free. You can have plenty of water for now, but you know you're going to need water later as well. So I guess what I'm trying to get you at is a situation of why should I choose to harm my own country to help another country, where like I'm not sure what gives a moral obligation for me as a citizen of one country to help out you know another country other than my own generosity, and that should be done not by a legal
So would
standard
you say
but
USA, like
based on
the
however I
aid
choose
that
to
the
be
United States
generous.
gives is something similar to that? Foreign aid?
Well, I don't think the aid that the U.S. gives is basically just packed in. It's not even democratic. I don't think that most people if we were to take a vote of people in the country, do you want us to be giving $5 billion of aid to, I don't know, Egypt or something? I believe that was the most in the last year. I think most people would say no. They would say, look, we've got our own problems here. $5 billion could get a lot of homeless people off the streets. So why should you use the $5 billion that's basically going to go to some rich dictator anyways, instead of using it on your own citizens? So yeah, I would not say it's justified. And the whole democracy thing is kind of a pretext. No one actually, if you take a look at how people vote, it's not based on foreign aid. That's not anyone's number one decision. So to say that, oh, we all vote on the foreign aid because we vote on our Congress members is a little bit disingenuous. I think most people disagree that we should be giving money to other countries rather than helping our own. And I think that if we want to help other countries, it should be done, individuals giving charity wise, not entire
So this
nations.
is so I wouldn't make the argument
If
that
that helps
things
kind
should
of
be done in
explain.
charity. I feel like the argument should be done that it's a more of a long-term investment in for greater gains for everyone, because everyone benefits from economic growth. Everyone benefits from more skilled people, that sort of thing. I feel like
Yeah.
it's more of like with what I'm sort of arguing for. It's more of a general philosophy where it's like if you if you can help people, you should try to. If you can't, like you can't. And my main what I was mainly going to bring up is that like the aspects of globalism I wanted to focus on was primarily through the more interconnected aspect of how the world works. So, for example, I was going to bring up in like scientific papers and how like like a lot of the like I think it was 25% of scientific papers are now joint research between in the from the EU and stuff like that. So it's more focusing on okay, so we have a country this and that, but in terms of what you were saying,
Okay. Well, if we
in terms of the water scenario, I'd say no, we shouldn't. We there are in that situation you can't really apply that sort of logic to yeah, I agree it's not always black and
right,
white.
but it's not always black and white
I'm
though,
just saying
right? Like
it's
the idea
probably
of
more
yeah.
likely that
Okay.
like globalism or or internationalist or whatever word you'd like to use for this sort of policy benefits both us and them more.
Okay. So I guess if you want to talk more about the economic aspects, we can do that. So yes, it's true that free trade does promote economic growth, but it also makes um, you know, the entire world vulnerable because if you think about it like this, when we were all disconnected, a single economic crisis in America wouldn't really affect the rest of the world. However, with how interconnected our markets are today, a single recession in America can set the entire world back decades. Nature has a lot of redundancies, and the you know the nature of economics is when you globalize, there's basically no redundancy. So a problem in one spot is going to lead to problems everywhere in the entire world. Uh, off, while it is true that you know we will grow more, we're also a lot more vulnerable to economic dangers and economic collapses because since we're all dependent on each other, if something happens to you know something bad happens in one country's economy that's important, well then we're all going to feel the pain of that. And so yes, we're benefiting in that our own growth is increasing, but we're also going to be sacrificing in that if, I don't know, let's say France does something fiscally irresponsible and it really hurts, they have to stop, completely have to stop buying stuff and it really hurts our economy. Well, we've we've sacrificed any benefit that we got from free trade in this crash, right? So it's not just it's not, in my opinion, just so clear cut
Yes,
that it's
and I do
obviously
agree with that.
beneficial. There are
But what
obviously
I'd say is that you
positives
can
and
mitigate the
negatives
negatives
to
by
free trade.
so for example in the global financial
So
crisis, I think out of most of the OECD countries, Australia was one of the best under the under the under the Rudd prime ministership. So one of the basically my point is that you can put in you can put in policies which can lessen the effects of such recessions, and you can also, and I'm not too educated on this particular piece, and I'm sure like a lot of other a lot of socialist thinkers would be like, oh well, socialism has recessions, etc., etc. Essentially, it's you can input policy which can lessen the effects of a recession in one area, and also the fact that recessions are
but what if they don't, right? They're autonomous regions. With 170 countries, there's bound to be a couple countries who are doing dumb stuff economically. Like look at if we look at Greece, right? If we look how Greece is hurting the eurozone, why should why should I put my country in such dependence where some other random country like Greece can make a mistake and it completely starts, being a complete burden on the EU. If we take a look at if we're taking a look at globalization, I think we should take a look at Germany. Take a look at how much the EU weighs down Germany. Germany is basically bankrolling all of these bankrupt countries in Europe. Uh, and for what reason? Like, are it's just encouraging these other countries to be more and more fiscally irresponsible. So if we make it so that the incentives aren't based on helping your own people, and if we take a look at we make it like, oh, it's for the greater good, all our countries are going to help each other, we're going to be super tight economically. Well, what happens eventually is one country is going to be pulling more of the weight than the other country. So I don't want my country to end up you know in Germany's fate, where it's really brought back by the EU and the
music.
organizations it's a part of. Like, I would you would you agree that financial, like, if we take a look at Germany giving up their own currency and going with the euro, and now that their currency is made of the euro, they're forced to basically bail out all these failing countries. Is that fair to Germany? Well, shouldn't Germany take I okay, this is going to sound bad, but
No,
shouldn't Germany
I
take more of a
understand.
nationalist approach to this? Now, again, obviously that sounds bad because of historical
I don't.
context, but
I think
I
you'd
think you
have
get the
to.
point
I
without
think to make that sort
obviously
of
the
accusation,
I
you'd
feel
have
like that's why
to
they don't do it. They
you'd have to posit the benefits and the negatives of. Oh, for fuck's sake! No, the music. But yeah,
I
sorry, I
didn't
didn't
hear
have
you.
music.
Can you repeat that? Sorry, the bot was.
I think in order to make this sort of accusation, you'd have to weigh and balance whether Germany actually benefits from the EU or not. And for that, you'd have to do case studies.
Right, and I'm telling you, I have weighed
I'd argue that it's
what
increased
benefits
trade.
is
And
Germany
yes, you
getting from
could
the
say,
EU.
oh, well, there's vulnerabilities and well, Greece is time sink. But then again, I haven't researched into Germany, so I can't really I can't just say, oh, well, you're right.
I mean,
Out of the blue.
I mean, yeah, I mean, increased trade. I mean, it's debatable. Like the amount of increased trade that's happened, that doesn't
Well,
require
I'd argue
sorts of
that free trade
globalization. Just
agreements
free
on
trade
their own
agreements
are
on their
also
own,
are part of
right?
globalization.
Would
Globalization
increase free trade, right?
isn't its own policy. Globalization is refers to a lot of different. As I said in the beginning, globalization.
Okay, well, would you say is an organization such as the EU more or less global than some sort of trade agreement? I would say it's more
Yeah, sure.
global. I'd say it's more
It's more
globalistic. It might,
globalistic.
globalism is a
But
scale, right?
I still wouldn't say that how do I describe it? I feel like the EU also has other benefits, like what's the freedom of movement that they have as well. Yeah,
Could
yeah, it
that
could
not have
have.
been
But if
accomplished without
if
an
your argument
international
is that well,
organization?
we don't really need an
Like, for
organization
example,
for that.
I mean, if you just say
Like if you're going to
what I'm saying is that all the
reach
things
the
that you're
same
saying are positives
results through
about
just
the
multiple different pieces of legislation, then I don't care. I don't care too much. But I find the European Union provides a sense for the
well,
European Union also can set regulations of different products as well, so it can streamline it for regular people.
Well, I mean, I don't know if the streamline beneficial, would be necessarily beneficial. What if the standards are too strict? Like, what if I don't know, let's say there is, a poorer country has obviously going to have less standards because, only when you become wealthy can you really afford to make it so that you can raise quality assurance. How is this not, hurting the poorer countries, these much harsher regulations that how is a third world country having to abide by first world countries' regulations beneficial to the third world country? And how does it help the first world country other than them just patting themselves on the back saying, "Oh, we solved all these problems," when we solved the problem of shitty products when really all they did is they got rid of the best products available to these third world countries. So
Wait,
I would say,
so the
what is the
core of your
benefit of
argument is
that?
that why
Like
are
I
regulations good for the first world, or
No, okay, well let's do a really stupid example, right? Let's say that Europe or the European Union decided that it was only safe to wear two helmets. All right, whenever you're riding a motorcycle, you have to wear two. And I know it's ridiculous, but you have to wear two helmets, right? Now, if we take a poor country such as I don't know, or a poor country in the European Union who can only afford to have one helmet, and because of these overly strict regulations, well, there's going to be a lot less, legal and sort of driving right now. So what I'm saying is, why, if the needs of and the means of countries are different, why should the regulations not be different as well, right? Doesn't it make sense to have the regulations properly tailored to the makeup of a country rather than just some global sort of thing? Like,
well, I'd
it
argue that
shouldn't, like,
I
let's say a country has
I'd argue that the global system
is
would have to
wetter
account
or
for
drier
those
than other
things in
countries.
those poorer
Like,
nations.
should we put
I don't like this. This seems like more critique of bad policy than it is the policy itself. Like,
well, I mean, bad policy as a result
sure,
of these international
but I'd
bureaucratic
also
organizations, right? Like, if the if a central planner in like the European Union doesn't realize that, hey, it's really dry in this region, so they don't, their cars are less likely to rust, right? So they can have less, strict standards on that sort of thing,
yeah, sure.
right?
Gonna
Because
put in a
drier
10-minute
region.
warning here. 10
Okay,
minutes.
sure thing. So that if it's drier, maybe the regulations are less. Well, central planners aren't going to be cognizant of the conditions in
Well,
every
that's
single
again
country, so they're
assuming that
bound to
central
make
planners
mistakes, sort of
don't. That's
such as
assuming,
this. Yes, it's a
but
thing
then
of
again,
bad
that's
policy,
assuming that
but
central
there's
planners
a
don't have
reason,
access to
right?
that information, which I'd argue is
Uh,
not really the fault of the policy itself, but rather the fault of central planners. You could say that it's due to bureaucracy, but then again, how do I describe this?
right.
There are ways in which you can limit that democracy.
Okay,
Like,
but here's what I'm saying. The regulators. Okay, but here's what I'm saying. The regulators within one country have much greater knowledge of their country's conditions and
yeah,
needs than
but
the regulators of the central agency like the EU, right? So, by the very nature, if their knowledge of it is better, then the central planner's knowledge of it has to be worse, like tautologically by definition,
I'd
right? If a country's central planner like if a country's the regulators in one countries have more knowledge about their certain prospective country than the EU central planners, then tautologically by definition the central planners have less information than the people inside the country. So yes, it's true that it's a bad policy's fault, not the fault of uh, globalism. But what I'm saying is that globalism creates these, events where because the regulators aren't as familiar with the global needs as they are with their own,
so would
the
you
needs of
argue
their
that's
own country, they're going to make these bad policies. So
so then
yes,
I'd make the argument that like
globalism is the
who
problem.
is put into place as part of these quote unquote central regulators. So if your argument is that
I mean,
yeah, so if your
I,
argument is that
that's
well
something you have.
central what is I keep thinking it's a fucking word used central regulators. If your argument is that central regulators won't have enough information about the area they're in, again, I wouldn't really blame it on the policy itself. What if you had what if you can decentralize the I guess how did I guess like there's it's essentially some sort of confederate like a confederacy.
So you're saying, what if we take,
So a confederate system.
well, Confederate? Okay, well, so what you're saying is,
No,
what if
I'm
we get
saying what if
regulators
we
from
get
one country and
regulators?
they only
What if we
regulate that
pool
one country?
regulators
Is kind
together
of what your solution to that problem is, and
and they
that
can
is
all decide
nationalism.
in a single way? So they can have the maximum information.
Yeah, so that
it's
they
sort of
know
like
the
an economy of scale.
right. But what you're
I guess if that counts.
right, but what your solution is basically coming to is okay. We'll have some planners specialized in each specific country.
No,
that
the
will make
regulations wouldn't be
sure
tailored
that the
differently
regulations
to
are
each
tailored
country. The
differently to those
regulations,
specific countries. What you're
the
describing.
final standard, the final standard which is set.
So I thought we agreed that regulation.
The final standard which is set would be at like would allow these countries to use them as well. That's the argument I'd promote. Like, if you have like, this is more of like
right,
this
but
is more of like a
let's
minimum standard
again if we talk
than it is. So
right, but if
I'm
we
pretty
take
sure you guys have the difference between state laws and like federal wages, right? So you guys have a minimum federal wage, but like in each state you guys have
I
your
mean
own
yeah, there's
minimum
a
wage.
difference.
Yeah. So it would probably so how I'd see it would be something similar to
Sure,
that.
yeah,
Now that isn't
pretty
nationalism
much.
per se. That isn't, or nor is that would be globalism. I wouldn't consider that globalism either. Or maybe I would. Yeah, I would. Okay, sorry. I'm not really, pissed if I don't know. I would consider that globalism in the sense that it's nations working together to reach a standard which is beneficial to both. And that's what I'd call the core of globalism. It isn't that it isn't about central bureaucracies saying, well, this is what you're meant to do. It's by countries coming together and mutually in a more mutual fashion where they collectively decide on what to do. That's yes, and I agree they can disagree.
But they can disagree, and because they're and what happens when they disagree? Shouldn't they be able to dissent? Shouldn't they be able to not follow? Like if they disagree, if 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 they
See,
disagree
but if
and
they
then they are
disagree and
allowed
they're
to
allowed to
change it,
change
I
it,
don't
then
see
they're
how
going
that's
to be
any
forced to
different than
follow
just
that
having
way.
your own
Because
country
there's
do their own
benefit
thing.
to having set regulations. It's easy on manufacturers to do so. And if you argue, well, and also the fact that like the rarity, I would argue that there is no benefit in having regulations, which means that like one country is significantly affected by it. Especially if the fact that like if that one country is like, say for example, um, Australia, New Zealand, and like Indonesia are in like a sort of EU type of thing, right? So let's say let's say that for phone chargers, for phone chargers, like Australia releases the collective releases a new regulation set on phone chargers. The problem, like is if that happens and say Indonesia can't accept, like Indonesia takes a hit for the production of those phone chargers. Like I wouldn't really call that like the fault of globalism. That's just the fault of bad planning. And once again, you've mentioned that countries can disagree. Well, yes, countries can disagree, but there's always going to be one person which is right in that scenario.
Well, I don't think there is always going to be one person. I think both people can be right that the needs of their countries
Yeah,
are served best by a particular policy, which isn't the same, right? It's not inherently true that you know it is entirely possible for one person to say no, this policy is good for my country, and
so that
another
means they
person
have to
with a different
renegotiate
country
to
say
like
no,
make sure they have
this
a minimum
policy
standard
is
for it.
bad. Right, but they're not even that might not even be possible, right? Like the idea, if your idea is okay, just have a minimum standard that's lower than everyone else's, well then it's not. It doesn't mean anything, right? If let's say we're like, okay, we're gonna have if let's say for example you added a super minimum wage, all right, a new federal law. Now even even the state laws they have to be above $1 an hour, right? That law is pretty much irrelevant and moot because well it doesn't change anything. So yes, if
Well,
you
you're not continually
continuously
lowering the
lower the
standards.
standards so that you're at the lowest standards possible and
it's a
that's your
give
base
and take.
standards, right? But
But I'd
if
argue
more
that
regulation helps
in
one
this case,
country,
more
right?
regulation
But
would have also
if more
helped the other
regulation
country
helps
in
one
terms of
country, it
safety,
hurts
for
another country.
example, or in terms of like carbon emissions, for example. But the thing is, right?
Okay, but what I'm saying is obviously there's going to be times where it isn't, right? It's if there's times where it is, great. They'll come to the same opinion. They'll have the same regulatory standards. My problem is there's going to be cases inevitably where that's not the case, and because that's not the case, well, in those cases, it would be best for the people of their own country to make their own policy. And I don't see how. Okay, well, what if? I feel like these what ifs, like, okay, what if everyone agrees and the same thing benefits everyone? Well, then yeah, our systems would be virtually identical because if it's in our country's self interest, we're going to do it, right? So our positions only differ in the place where one country where I'm making a decision that is going to hurt or help my country, right? The only time that our policies are different at all is in those cases where there is no one answer, where one size doesn't fit all. That's the only time where our systems are going
And
to
I
have
agree,
any
and I would
disagreement.
still say that it's about renegotiating, trying to have the best of both worlds. But also the fact that, like,
Well, then
what,
if you
like,
agree, then we can't
as like
talk
a
about the.
counterpoint, what if one
It,
country decides to do something which is like a net negative to its own well-being? Then what? Well, it's done it. It's done so in the past.
why would it do that? It hasn't done it at a higher frequency than because
Sure.
obviously we're gonna be talking about frequencies here. Is it going to be done on just as frequently as I guess what I'm saying is this: is a person planning for their own country going to do a better job and on average come to the correct decision more often than person of a country that isn't theirs planning for that country, right? So would put it like this: I'm American. Would I do a
Well,
better job planning for
it depends
America
on the
or a
information
better
you
job
have at
planning for
hand.
New
If we're
Zealand?
if
I think I would do a better job
Yeah, then I'd still say then yes. If
even with
someone
all
has
the
all the
information
information
possible,
at hand
right?
and
Like
is
I
actually like
can't
skilled in their
understand what it's
field
like.
but doesn't live in that certain country, then yeah, I think they should have the right to like
Right. Well,
at least posit policy for that country.
right, but my point is that objectively, even in that situation, who would be better at planning, me or a person has all the same
I'd say they're
qualifications
equal.
as me, but also lives in
I
Taiwan?
I would say they're equal.
Obviously, the
I don't
person who
see
also lives
any
in Taiwan, you would say
reason consider
there's no benefit
if
for
both of
actually
you have the same
belonging to a
knowledge and the
country.
same amount of information available and the same set of skills, I see no reason why that person would be better at like addressing the needs of your country than you would theirs.
Well, all of our knowledge is going to be limited, right? So I don't have infinite knowledge. Neither
Yeah,
does
but this is also assuming that
the central planner
all policies passed by
of
say
what
like
was the
the
country I
U.S. government
used?
is good for the U.S. people. Like, eh,
Mhm. Well, but all I'm talking about is in the cases that it's different, right? In the cases that the goals of countries aren't aligned, what should we do? And in the case where the goals of countries aren't aligned, the country should follow their own interests. And I think that's what
I don't
nationalism
care whether
is.
countries follow their
Is that just
interests or not.
countries
What I
following
care
their
about
own
is
self
about
interest?
the
Like if we take a look at
sorry.
America first,
I c-
like when I or other people say America first, what we mean is, hey, look, we understand our needs better than we understand their needs. They understand their needs better than they
yeah,
understand our needs.
and I would
The
disagree
easiest
with that
solution to
depending
this
on
is
sort of
just
like
to
body you're
focus
speaking.
on our own
If
needs.
if for example like if you're saying well okay, here's a random dude from Thailand and here's like you. Oh, okay, so the random dude of Thailand is gonna vote in your elections. Would you say that that's an informed vote? Well, yeah, but would you say that? And
I don't
again,
think
you
any
say
votes
that
can be
you've
fully
mentioned before that
informed
you believe
because
in
there's so much
probabilities, right?
information needed.
In not in black and white, but in grays. So would you say that they're more likely to be informed than
Yeah,
you are if they have no information? No, all right. But if say for example, if you have
no,
information
obviously not.
and the other person has enough like the similar information and has just moved into the country like after a year, would you say like they would you say that they can make an equal informed decision as you?
I, I'd say they can make a more informed decision than when they hadn't lived here for a year. Would they? Could I say equally to me? Probably not, because I
Does
will always have
experience
more experience
translate
living in my
to
country than them. There's
actual
no
good
way for our
policy?
experiences to be equal. It, it,
Which
in in
avenues?
in certain avenues, absolutely. The best way to understand the needs of a country is to be
Which
okay.
avenues would
Which avenues
having
exactly
personal
does it?
experience
What do
benefit
you
when it
mean?
comes to making policy?
Well, I mean, if we're talking policy
Okay, sure.
specifics, which avenues? I mean, I can't
But see,
list
that's
them off the
my
top of
argument
my
is that
head. Like,
I don't think
do
experience
you
matters. What
agree that
like
they exist,
necessarily
or like
matters? I think information matters. I think education matters. I think skills matter. And like the most of the reasoning you've
Right, but
shown isn't really like
information is like
isn't that
experience is a
like
part of
oh
information,
well
right?
people who live in the country are inherently more likely to know what's good for that country. Most of what I gather from your thing is oh well people in that country are more likely to have more information about their own country, which I do agree with. I think I wouldn't say that experience
Well, those are connected problems.
like an economist from say an economist from the UK looking at an American economy, like I would say is the same as like an American economist looking at their own economy. Because this is assuming.
Okay, well, that's a purely there's the different. Okay. So I think I know where the difference. The difference here is that one is descriptive, right? Economics is going to be, it's going to be the description of forces that should be completely independent of the country. Now, public policy is prescriptive, right? Meaning that there's more to it than just the is. There's the what we should do, and that can genuinely differ based on perspective, right? So what I'm saying, yes, in a field where that's purely descriptive, of course, someone with an Asian with the same, or like a Filipino with the same amount of math knowledge as me is going to be just as good at solving math problems as I am, right? That's obvious. However, if we're making claims like, okay, what should we do or what should we value? Those questions that aren't purely objective and are prescriptive are not going to have that same sort of effect. And since public policy is a prescriptive endeavor, meaning that what we talk about in public policy, or we're saying what we ought to do. We're not describing what is the case. We're just describing what we ought to do. These differences are meaningful, and differences in experience and will equate to understanding. The only way that's what I'm
Well,
talking about. So I don't
when
think
I
the
mentioned economics, I was mostly
debate
talking
is
about
the
like
same. Maybe
prescriptive
this similar
economics,
thing
so
would
like
be about
economic policy,
ethics.
right? But I would also make the argument that like, well, there's also even
Okay,
if
well,
you have
if
a similar experience, there's still like distinctions between like those groups in those countries. For example, like a liberal in New York is gonna have like a differing view than say a conservative in New York or like conservative in another state, even though they're technically all American.
Of course, that's why we let them have different right, but that's why we let them have different policies, right? That's the whole point of federalism. That it's helpful and beneficial for people of different, you know, belief structures and different, normative desires to actually have different laws, right? That's the entire point of federalism. Like, it, what if we take yes, I agree.
Yeah, but
I
what about
agree
the
that
liberal New
the
Yorkers and
New
the
Yorkers and
conservative
Texans
New
are going to be
Yorkers,
different. That's
despite
why I
them
think it's
having the same
good that they have
experience, they're
somewhat
going to
different laws.
arrives at like.
They don't have the same experience. I look again. I go even farther than nationalists. Like I think that
Are you an
the desires
egoist?
of states. You know, I feel like the same problems we're talking about here. I think that you should be in Arizona. Like I live in Arizona, so I'm an Arizona first kind of guy, right? I think that I care about the needs of Arizonans more than I care about the needs of I don't know fucking Delawareans. Like fuck Delaware, right? Who cares?
Don't you dare attack Delaware.
Okay, well
Um,
I mean
I'm
so
sorry. I want to jump in real quick. It is 6 minutes after.
okay.
I think I think it's a great debate. If you guys want to keep going, I'm not going to tell you no.
Okay. Well, I feel like at this point I should
Yeah, I
at
figured
least
that
come
out.
clean that I am not, in fact, a nationalist. Um,
Yeah, some
I,
things were
I don't
confusing to
know how
me,
to
like
argue from the
especially with
position
like
of a nationalist.
with your argument is
That
that um I wouldn't say that most nationalists would like agree with free trade. I guess from what like the sort of argument what I was expecting was oh well free trade is bad.
yeah,
We need to
probably not.
maintain an autarky. We need to bring like manufacturing jobs back into the U.S. We shouldn't let immigrants in because of cultural reasons and stuff like that. That's like the sort of nationalist arguments I was expecting. But you've made a pretty interesting case for against like my sort of view on global
Yeah. Well,
relations and like geopolitics, something which I haven't really researched into, and I really do appreciate that. So thank you.